Hello everybody, this is Rabbi Gershom Francis, and you're listening to Teiras Arizal. Here we'll talk about the kavanos of the Arizal for Chol, Shabbos, and Yomim Tovim. This shir is dedicated in the memory of my father, Rabbi Yisrael Menachem Mendel ben Avraham Olav Hashalom. You can now dedicate a shir in the honor of a loved one by supporting the shir on Spotify. We hope you enjoy. L'shem yichud, kudshabrichu u'shchinte. Now that we're reading Sefer Shemos, let's take a moment to talk about these powerful days called Shovevim. First, we'll talk about the Shovevim Beruchnius, and then we'll talk about the minhag of some people to fast, those that don't fast, and end off with some simple tikunim of what you can do during these days. Reb Chaim Vital was megala what the Ari Hakadosh taught about the weeks of Shovevim. Although the Arizal wasn't the first to mention the Shovevim, he revealed to us how vital and important these weeks are. And even if a person doesn't do the tikunim through fasting, there's still an inyan to learn about the Shovevim, which is insightful for Avodas Hashem. Perhaps that's why the Alter Rebbe has a mimer called Lahavin Inyan HaShovevim. Because of this, we'll explain the Shovevim as the Ari Hakadosh taught, and then we'll bring down what the Alter Rebbe said as well. Before we explain the Shovevim, it's important to know that sometimes in Yanei D'Yoma come from the Yom Tov itself. For example, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, these days are Yomim Tovim. And on top of that, Anshe Knesset HaGdola was metaken that certain parshiyos should be read in Shul. But for the rest of the year, we learn the Inyanei D'Yoma from what we're reading in the Torah week by week. Shovevim stand for the parshiyos of Shmos, Va'era, Ba, Bishalach, Yisroi, and Mishpatim. And in Shana Me'uberes, where there's 2 Chadashim of Adar, we're metaken more by adding the parshas of Truma and Tetzaveh. That's the minhag. From the beginning of Parshas Shemos, we enter into the special weeks of Shovevim, and therefore we automatically say V'hayomim ha'ela nizkarim v'nasim, that the koyach hatikum which occurs in these parshas of Shovevim have the power to reoccur every single year. Let's talk about the Shovevim itself. In Masechta Eruvin, Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar explained that Adam Rishon separated from Chava for 130 years. During this time of isolation, Adam Rishon's body produced ruchos or neshamas without gufim, since he was without his wife. The Torah says, "Vayichi Adam 30 shana, vayeled bidmusay ketzalmai." Adam Rishon lived 130 years, and only then did he once again give birth in his image and likeness. So, as the Gemara says, "Michlal da'ad ha'ivna lav ketzalmai alid," that until 130 years, he had children, but they weren't in his likeness. During his years of isolation, only ruchos or neshamas without gufim were created from him. And as we know, neshamas that are born in this way are held back by the Sitra Achra, Rachman al-Litzlan. Only at the end of 130 years did he give birth to regular offspring, which was Shes. Now, it's important to know that Adam Rishon himself was a big chassid. And the reason why he separated himself from Chava was in order to fast and do teshuvah for the Chet Eitz Hadas. And as the Gemara in Eruvin points out, that the long period of isolation of 130 years, being without his wife, it brought his body by force to produce ruchos and neshamas without gufim, and as we mentioned before, neshamas that come from a person in this way need a tikkun. What the tikkun does is release them from the Sitra Achra and bring them towards the Sitra de Kedusha. And just as a neshama can come back to this world multiple times to achieve its tachlis, these neshamas of Adam Rishon came back for a tikkun. And this is exactly what it says in Iyuv, Hein kol eile yipal el shalish pamim and gover, that a neshama can come back 3 and multiple times in order to receive its tikkun. Sometimes it could be Neitzer Chesed La'alafim. A neshama can come back quite a great amount of times in order to attain a tikkun. And the tikkun will be when the neshama finally gets its nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, and yechida. So these neshamas were nisgagal, or reincarnated for the first time during Dor HaMabul, the generation of the flood. This Dor was intentionally engaged in that Avera, and because of this they were wiped away in the Mabul. It says in the Torah about the generation of the flood, about the Dor HaMabul, Vayar Hashem ki rabba ro'as ha'adam be'oretz, v'kol yetzer machshavos liboy rak kol hayom. Hashem saw that the negativity which came from mankind increased, and his thoughts were only towards Ra all day long. And the Ari Hakadosh taught that this pasuk is really telling us that the people of Dur HaMabul were really from those neshamas that came from Adam Rishon, which were nisgalgal, reincarnated. And that's why the pasuk says, Ra'as ha'adam, the negativity that came from man, the negativity which came from man. Adam Rishon himself wasn't alive anymore, but Hashem saw the Ra which came from Adam Rishon, which were these neshamas that still required a tikkun. They were nisgalgal during that time to receive a tikkun, but they weren't doing what they were supposed to do. So since these neshamas couldn't perfect themselves, Hashem said, Emcha esa Adam asher barasi. Then the neshamas were magulgal again in the next generation, the Dur HaFlaga. This was the Dur which built Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Bavel, and they continued to rebel against Hashem. There the Torah says, Vayeir Hashem liras es ha'ir va'amigdal asher banu b'nei ha'adam. And again, the Ari Hakadosh shows us what the Torah is saying, that this is a rebellion from b'nei ha'adam, those ruchos that came from Adam Rishon. So these neshamas didn't receive their tikkun even the second time they were nisgalgal, since they rebelled against HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And if you think about it, you could understand now how the city of Sodom became so corrupt. The Pri Eitz Chaim, the Talmidim of the Arizal, say that these neshamas of Adam Rishon, who were born during his 130 years of isolation from his wife, were also nisgalgal during the times of Sodom. But again, of course, in Sodom, they didn't achieve their tikkun either. As the Torah says, V'anshi Sodom royim v'chatoim la'Hashem. And they say that a neshama is a diamond in the rough. Now, diamonds are formed after sitting many years in the ground. At first, they don't shine, but then they're taken out of the dirt and refined. Zichuch acher zichuch, purification after purification. And little by little, the dirt goes away and the diamond is beautiful. We also need to remove the gashmius dika things which keep our neshama from attaining its tachlis on earth. And when we polish ourselves, our neshama comes out more and more. Now these neshamas which came from Adam Rishon were later on broken into two groups. One group found their tikkun entirely and were nisgalgal in Bnei Yisrael, in Mitzrayim. And then there's the other group who was Mekurev be'emes by Yaakov Avinu, who was Megayer Gerim in Mitzrayim, and by Yosef HaTzadik, who decreed Bris Milah on the Mitzrim. These later neshamas became the Erev Rav. These were pockets of people who lived in their own areas in Mitzrayim, and they didn't mix with the other Mitzrim. There were also more than double the amount of Bnei Yisrael. And you read the L'tzur Chaliyah. Every time the neshama comes back, it attains a higher tikkun. The neshamas which came from Adam Rishon were really on a high level. After all, they came from Adam Rishon. But they needed to be purified step by step from the Rishus and Chiza of the Keli and Sitra Achra. Have in mind that all the neshamas that were born in Mitzrayim during that time were all from the same source as Moshe Rabbeinu. Spiritually, the neshamas came from the same source as Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was from Das Dezer Anpin, and these neshamas that were born during Mitzrayim were mushrash, sourced within that very place as well. And Be'emes, Moshe Rabbeinu was unlike the rest of the generation, since he was nimshech from Sheis, the son of Adam Rishon, who was born after the 130-year period that Adam Rishon did teshuvah. Even though these neshamas were from those years that Adam Rishon was without his wife, and these neshamas were nisgalgal many, many times, nevertheless, their makar was also from Das Dezer Anpin. So the tikkun for these neshamas finally come in Mitzrayim. All that occurred from Adam Rishon till now finally found its tikkun by the Gzeres of Parai. To Matake and all that occurred during Dur HaMabul, the Dur of the flood, Hashem made Parai decree that every firstborn should be thrown in the river. Not the girls, since they were not involved in that chait. Dafka the boys who carry the bris milah. Mida keneged mida. And to Matake, all that occurred during Dur HaFlaga, the generation that built the Tower of Bavel, the people of Migdal Bavel said, Hava nilban elevenim. Let's go and make bricks. And because of this, Hashem made Parai decree against Bnei Yisrael, Vayemaru es chayehem b'aveda kasher b'chorma uvilvenim, that Parai made Bnei Yisrael build and build and build, mida keneged mida. After that, Bnei Yisrael was finally ready to leave Mitzrayim, since those neshamas which came from Adam Rishon and were nisgalgal many times already received their tikkun. But the neshamas that were mekurev through Yaakov and Yosef, this second group, they had a little bit more to do. Moshe Rabbeinu was focused on these neshamas. Now, as we mentioned before, the neshamas were broken into two groups. Those neshamis that were mekuv through Yaakov and Yosef became the Erev Rav, and the other neshamis were born within Bnei Israel. The Ari Hakadosh explained that the neshamis of the Erev Rav are those which the Torah calls kashe oref, stiff-necked. And the reason why they're called stiff-necked is because they're from the oref, they're from the neck area, which is behind Sfiras Hadas, the Zer Anpin. And for that very reason, they're called Erev Rav. There are two inyanim. There's Erev Rav and there's Erev Zer. Erev Zer are those neshamis which are nimshech to the Vav, which is Zer Anpin, but Erev Rav are those neshamis which are nimshech from the same bechina of Moshe Rabbeinu, which is Das de Zer Anpin. Erev Rav is actually the gematria of Das as well. And in truth, the neshamis of the Erev Rav, the Kashay Oref as they're called, they didn't fully receive their tikkun until they went into the desert, where they had to organize themselves and learn dinim and be judged by Moshe from morning until evening. After that, they were ready to receive Kabbalah Torah. But this wasn't a simple process. Let's be clear here. The panim of Das is the metzach, the forehead area. The achor of Das is where we put the dalet of the tefillin in the back of our head. Paroi, which is Oref, took hold in this area, right under the dalet of the tefillin. Now Kelly and the Sitra Achra had a great achiza during those times on this area, and would draw a kedusha from there. And since the neshamis that came from Adam were pagum, they were all necessarily nishtabed to Paroi. Then the Olam HaSfiros worked to minimize the pagam by removing Zer Anpin off the grid, as they call it. Zer Anpin minimizes and goes from Chagas and Nehi to Chagas within Nehi, 3 within 3, leaving very little for Kelly and Achizas Achitzonim. And in a sense, Bnei Yisrael is like a Uber B'mei Imai, representing Zer Anpin, which was Take and Uber B'mei Imai, as it went Gimel Goy Gimel, 3 within 3. And now we could understand what the Torah later says, Re'isi asa amazeh v'hine am kishe oref hu. I have seen this nation, and they are stiff-necked. This was due to the fact that the chet of the Erev Rav eventually reached parts of Leah, which is the dalet of the tefillin. And Mida Keneged Mida, Hashem wanted to minimize parts of Rachel, chas v'sholem. This would have been a catastrophe for Bnei Yisrael, whose direct source is parts of Rachel, the Sphira of Malchus. The Ari Hakadosh said that Hashem would have made a new structure of 10 spheros from parts of Leah, which sits behind the Das of Zer Anpin. And unlike Sphiras HaMalchus, this new parts of Leah would not get affected. And this is why Hashem said, I'll make you, Moshe Rabbeinu, into a great nation, since Leah is dependent on the Or of Das, which is behind the Bechina of Moshe Rabbeinu, Das de Zer Anpin. That's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu focuses on Moshe Rabbeinu and building from Moshe Rabbeinu at that point. Now let's not get confused. Aside from these neshamis which came from Adam Arisha, there's also another inyan, to be metaken rapach nitzutzos, the 288 sparks. These 288 sparks, which is the gematria of rapach, they fell during Shviras HaKelim. The Talmidei Ho'ari mentioned the pasuk, V'gam Erev Rav Ola Itam, that also the Erev Rav went up with Bnei Yisrael, and they explain that Bnei Yisrael was metaken Rav Nitzutzos, 202 sparks from the 288. And that would mean that there's only 86 Nitzutzos left. That's a different inyan. That's the inyan of the Rapach Nitzutzos. For this shir, we're focusing specifically on the neshamis which come from Adam Rishon and the Shovevim. And just as a side note, it's important to point out the question of why did it take Bnei Yisrael so short a time to be metaking 202 Rav Nitzutzos in Mitzrayim, but we're in Gullus for thousands of years for only 86 Nitzutzos. The Lubavitch Rebbe answered this and said that since those neshamas that were in Mitzrayim were leading neshamas, they were the Shvatim, they were neshamas Kloliyos, they came from Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they had the ability to be metaking much more in a shorter amount of time. Whereas in Galus, these neshamas are branches of branches of branches of branches. And so we can't be metaking things that fast. It really has to do with the shirish of your neshama. The neshama is in a sense like a magnet, and it's able to draw up a certain amount of sparks, a certain amount of nitzutzos. So our neshamas are only shaykh to a certain amount of nitzutzos, but their neshamas were much greater neshamas. They were sources. the heads of tribes, the heads of the heads of Am Yisrael, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and the Shvatim. So their neshamas had a magnet to pull up much greater netzutzos. It's a different topic entirely. So getting back to the tikkun of neshamas that came from Adam Rishon, we see that these parshes describe the tikkun of Bnei Yisrael. These weeks bring a koyach that is able to be metaken any chet that's related to shmiras habris, zivugim, and kol hamistayef, and everything related to that. Whether the chet was done on purpose or by accident, and as we say, ki yimei tzeischa me'eretz Mitzrayim ar enu neflois, just as those neshamas receive a tikkun, we have the ability to be zeicha for a tikkun today as well. Now, in truth, the Ari Hakadosh taught that all neshamas come from chasadim and gevuros of das to zer anpin. Das is the inyan of zivug, a yichud between chachma and bina, and from this yichud, chasadim and gevuros are nimshech to das to zer anpin. That's why this yichud, to bring down neshamas, is also called das, v'ha'adam yodas chava. What's the shurish of these chasadim and gevuros? Chachma contains chamisha chasadim, 5 chasadim, which are nimshech from netzach de'atik, that is later on miluvish in the kesef yamin, in the right shoulder of arich, and then finally to malchus of chachma. Parts of ima or bina contains chamisha gevuros from ahoy de'atik, that is miluvish within the kesef smol, the left shoulder of arich, and is nimshech to malchus de bina. That's the makar of these chasadim and gevuros. Bnei Yisrael mirrors all that occurs in Shamayim. The Ari Hakadosh explained that whenever there's a pagam lamata, there's a pagam within the Ulam HaSfiras, chas v'sholem. When this happens, chitzonim, or the sitra achra, are sholet and take energy from kedusha, chas v'sholem. And that's exactly how Mitzrayim came to power. It was only natural. The place of Mitzrayim, their makim beruchnius, is called Mitzrayim, Meitzar, which is the tight spot, which is the neck. And that's where these chasadim and gvuros are nimshich to das dezer anpin. Many of those neshamas which came from Adam Rishon later became called kashay aref, stiff-necked, because they're also coming from this place where neshamas are nimshich. Any pagam in this area of das dezer anpin gives a little bit of chayes to sitra achra chas v'sholem. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu made something interesting occur. There's a concept called Chazaras Chasadim Liyasoid Ima. The Chasadim retreat back to their source, which is Yesoid of Bina. When there's a problem with the Chasadim and Gvuros that are supposed to be Nimshech to Das Dezer Anpin, the Chasadim jump backwards, they retreat. In other words, the Chasadim and Gvuros are supposed to be Nimshech to Das Dezer Anpin. But when this type of Chatoyim occur, it causes the Chasadim to retreat and not want to be Nimshech to Das Dezer Anpin. So therefore, they retreat to their source, which is Yesod Debina. But during the Shovevim, these Chasadim and Gvuros found their tikkun and were Nimshech Lamata. How do we see that these neshamas got their tikkun? The Ari Hakadosh explained that Chesed is the exact gematria of 72. So if we count the word Chesed 5 times for the 5 Chasadim, we have 5 times 72. 5 times 72 is 360. That's the exact gematria of the word Shovevim. This signifies the ability to bring down these chasadim and to produce neshamas misitra de kedusha, perfected neshamas. Now these chasadim became the shivim nefesh. What are the shivim nefesh that were in Mitzrayim? So there are 5 chasadim. The 5 chasadim are chesed, gevura, tiferes, and netzach and hod. But the chasadim which are mispashet from Abba and Ima are broken into 2 parts. This is called chasadim mekusim, the chasadim that are covered or shaded underneath the partsufim of Abba and Ima. Those are called chasadim mekusim, chasadim that are covered by the partsufim of Chachma and Bina. And then there's chasadim megulim, and these are chasadim which are not in the levush, shaded or covered by the higher partsufim of Abba and Ima. And the truth of the matter is, connected these 3 chasadim is why we have 3 aliyos during the weekday. We at least are makabel 3 chasadim. So there are 5 chasadim: chesed, gevura, tiferes, netzach, and hod. Yesod is kolol kulam. Now, which chasadim are covered? 2.5. Chesed and Gvura, and 1/3 of Tiferes. These chasadim are covered by the partsufim of Abba and Ima, but the chasadim of Netzach and Hod and 2/3 of Tiferes are not covered by the partsufim of Abba and Ima, and they're called chasadim migulim. The Ari Hakadosh said that each chesed is a full Shem Havaya, equaling 26. So if we count the chasadim migulim, the revealed chasadim, we have Netzach, Hod, and 2/3 of Tiferes. It would then be 26, 26, and half of 26, which is 13. And in total, we'd have 70. That is the siman of the Shivim Nefesh that was in Mitzrayim. And as you mentioned before, when there's a chet, HaKadosh Baruch Hu made it so that the Olam HaSfiros prepare for it and sort of protect itself from the chet. And this is called Chazaras Chasadim Liyesod Ima. The Chasadim retreat to Yesod of Bina, and they're not mispashet to Das Dezer Anpin. The Ari HaKadosh also explained that the remez for this is the years that they spent in Mitzrayim. Since there's Chazaras Chasadim Liyesod Ima, all of the chasadim sit there within Yesod of Bina and are represented by the levush of Bina. Now the levush of Bina is the shem of Ekiah. So if we have chasadim and gvurais, you have 5 chasadim and 5 gvurais, and they're all retreating into Yesod of Bina, parts of Avima. Since they're in this area, they're within the Yesod of Bina, so there's 10 shemos of Ekiah. 10 shemos of Ekiah equal the amount of time that Bnei Yisrael would suffer in Mitzrayim. Because each Ekiah is 21. And 10 times 21 is 210 years. That's Ridu Shana. That's the time that they actually spent suffering in Mitzrayim. But because of this, Moshe Rabbeinu believes that Galus is going to be for 260 years. Because if the Pagam is the Pagam of Das, then really the 5 chasadim and 5 gevuros would need to be mitukan. They would need to be perfected. And if we say that each chesed is a Shem Havaya and each gevura is a Shem Havaya, so if we count 10 times Shem Havaya, which is 10 times 26, you get the number of 260. And that would be the tikkun for the sphere of Das Dezer Anpin. And Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to be metaken Das Dezer Anpin. So Moshe Rabbeinu thought that there would be a 260-year period. But Hashem explained to Moshe Rabbeinu that the Olam HaSfiros have protective measures, and that Zer Anpin is considered to be within Ima, within Bina, just as a Uber b'mei Imai. And because of this, there's only 10 shemos of Ekiah, which is the same place where Zer Anpin retreats to. And therefore, it's Ridu, 210, and not 260 years. Hashem also hinted to Moshe Rabbeinu that the Shem of Ekiah will be the best tikkun needed to fix the neshames which came from Adam Arishain. The Ari Hakadosh explained that if you write out the miloi of the Shem of Ekiah, and you write out each of those letters, it comes to 27 letters. So now, if there's 10 times Ekiah, and we write it out 10 times, so that's 10 times 27. And 10 times 27 is 270. And this implies that bringing the Oris of Zer Anpin back within Yesod the Ima, and giving it the levush of Ima, giving it the protective measures of Bina, it brought a tikkun for the Ra. The Ra is Gematria 270. These 10 shemes of Ekiah written out, which comes to 27 each shem, 10 times 27 is 270. So that provided already the perfect tikkun. And this is like a mechanical process. Mitzrayim is the Meitzar, the tight spot, which is the neck. And the neck is Oref. Oref is backwards for Paroi. And Paroi is also the same place as Garoin, which means throat. And whenever this happens, Zer Anpin enters a state of Katnus HaMoichen. Katnus HaMoichen is when the Chabad of Zer Anpin is not regular Chabad, but it's Katnus HaMoichen, that each Chachma, Bina, and Das is represented by Elikim, Elikim, and Elikim. Shemes of Elikim. The Chabad is Shemes of Elikim. So when you calculate the gematria of 3 shemes of Elokim, it comes to Garoin. And guess what? Garoin is also the amount of 270. So when you calculate 3 times Elokim, which represent Chachma, Bina, and Das of Zer Anpin, it equals up to the same gematria as Garoin. And Garoin means throat, and it represents Zer Anpin being in a state of Katnus HaMoichen. And this mirrors off of Bnei Yisrael. While these chasadim are chayzer liyasei de'ima, and there comes about a state of katnus hamoichen, so for us we feel it down here on earth. And although we mentioned in other shiurim that katnus hamoichen, shemas of Elokim, is still moichen, nevertheless it's just not enough to affect the midos. That's the idea of an ineffective faith, which doesn't affect the way you feel and act. This reflects the difficulties of Bnei Yisrael in Mitzrayim before the arrival of Moshe Rabbeinu. When Moshe Rabbeinu arrives, it's a siman of something great. What's going on? Moshe Rabbeinu is das dezer anpin. That means that the chasadim are nimshech to das dezer anpin. And because of this, he brought his generation to the darga of dur deya, a generation of knowledge. These neshamas finally found its tikkun. They finally achieved the darga that they were supposed to be on. In Chassidus, the return of the Chasadim to Das Dezer Anpin is signified by Moshe Rabbeinu instilling emunah in Bnei Yisrael in a way that affects them. When the Chasadim are not nimshech to Das Dezer Anpin, our faith is an ineffective faith. We could sometimes actually stoop so low that we ask Hashem to give us atzlacha to do an aveira chas v'sholem. But Moshe Rabbeinu brought true emunah. And because of this, down here it's reflected on earth that the hearts of Bnei Yisrael were affected to do teshuvah and be redeemed. That's why these weeks are so powerful for teshuvah, tikkun averos, and emunas hatzadikim. And as we said, v'hayamim ho'ela nizkarim v'nasim, just like there was a great tikkun for those neshamas that came from Adam Rishon, there's also the ability for us to receive a great tikkun for our neshamas today.